Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at a boss from recent raid testing on the 7.3 PTR, which is Garothi Worldbreaker.
Yes, this is the first boss of the upcoming new raid, Antorus the Burning Throne. Apart from looking awesome, this guy is actually a really decent first boss. The fight has pretty high movement requirements and a good amount of coordination is needed to deal with his simple yet devastating abilities.
Now before we jump into the fight, just as a reminder, this is footage from early PTR testing, so everything you see now is subject to change. And if they do change substantially on the PTR, we will make another video for it, as well as of course, once this boss finally does reach live servers, our live guide will be out for it as well. But let's kick straight into it, and let's talk about him.
The first thing we're going to talk about is the tank ability, which is Fell Bombardment. The boss will mark the tank with a 5-second debuff, and after this expires, the boss will now throw missiles towards that tank every second for 5 seconds. These missiles deal a ton of damage and knock back anyone within 7 yards of their landing location. To deal with this, we found that as soon as the tank gets the debuff, they need the other tank to taunt, and then they need to create some distance between themselves and the boss. As the missiles come in, the tank just needs to run around to avoid getting hit by any of them. You need to be far away from the boss to dodge the missiles, as they do have a travel time. We found that if you're too close, you're not able to move out of the way of them and you'll just get chain hit by them until you die. Using movement speed increases really helps out with this ability as well, but as long as you can get away from the boss before the missiles come in, you can easily dodge them just fine by running in a straight line.
Now the two main abilities that the raid need to deal with is Decimation and Annihilation. Decimation will apply debuffs to a couple of players in the raid, and after this debuff expires, a large circle will be placed on the ground underneath those players. A few moments later, the circle will explode, dealing damage to anyone nearby as well as a small amount of damage to the raid. So it's very similar to the demonic upheaval ability from the last boss in the Cathedral of Eternal Night 5-man instance. As soon as you have the debuff, you just need to move out of the raid, it will explode, and then you move back. Simple as that. We found that having the raids somewhat stacked up allowed the debuff players a little bit more room to work with, as well as allowing the healers to easily AoE the small amount of damage that comes in afterwards. When Annihilation is cast, it creates 3 zones around the encounter area. Their location seems to be somewhat random, although we did notice that one always spawns near melee. These act in the exact same way as the Touch of Sargeras circles from Fallen Avatar. They simply just explode after a short amount of time, dealing huge raid-wide damage. However, if players stand within it, they'll soak a smaller amount of damage instead. We found in our raid size 2 to 3 players to stand within each zone was a good idea, as the damage that you do receive is split between everyone within it. Of course, in larger raid sizes you're going to need even more players. Also to note, every player that does get hit will also receive a fairly hard hitting 10-second dot, so healers need to make sure that the soakers are healthy before the hit comes in and heal them up afterwards while they're receiving the dot. And apart from those 2 signature abilities that the raid needs to deal with and the missiles that it's firing on the tanks, the boss doesn't do anything else until you reach 65% health.
At this point, a couple of things will happen. He will stop casting his abilities and will instead channel Apocalypse Drive. This deals ticking damage to the group over roughly 20 seconds, whilst also creating large lines on the floor which explode, dealing near lethal damage to anyone caught inside, so make sure you don't stand in it. At the end of the Apocalypse Drive, the boss will one-shot the group. So to stop the drive, you actually need to destroy one of the 2 exposed weapons on the boss's back, which is either the Annihilator or the Decimator. Killing the Annihilator will remove the Annihilation ability from the encounter, and killing the Decimator will remove the Decimation ability from the encounter. The weapon that you do leave up will become empowered and will make that mechanic more difficult to deal with, but we'll get to this in a moment. Either way, once one of the weapons has been destroyed, the Apocalypse Drive cast will stop and the boss will cast Eradication, which deals a ton of damage to the raid, which drops off with distance. So as soon as a weapon has been killed, we had everyone move to the back of the room just to reduce this otherwise lethal damage. However, we did keep one tank next to the boss with a big cooldown, as the boss will start dealing large damage to the group if nobody is within melee range. As soon as he's done this Eradication, he will gain 2 permanent buffs. One will increase his damage of all of his abilities just by 20%, and the other deals pretty nasty ticking damage to the entire group. And the fight from this point now continues, with you either having to deal with an empowered Decimation or an empowered Annihilation. Now the empowered Annihilation now makes 7 zones appear rather than 3. This makes the fight substantially more difficult, especially in smaller raid sizes, as you need to try and make sure that every zone has at least some people inside. We're not entirely sure if the amount of zones that spawn scales up with raid size. If they don't and you always have 7 regardless of your raid size, then maybe having an empowered annihilation isn't actually that bad with 30 people. But it certainly wasn't ideal with 12, as trying to soak each zone whilst topping up people's dots and out healing the ticking damage from the boss was far from easy. And you also had to try and have 2 people per zone, or somebody with a large damage reduction or immunity to solo soak, which you very quickly run out of in a small raid size. What is more viable, however, is the empowered Decimation. This just now applies more debuffs out on the raid. In our case, we had 6 rather than 2. To deal with this, we found that you could just have 2 stack points in front of the boss and switch between them each time the zones appeared. This does require a lot of movement, which isn't great for a mobile range DPS. However, this does allow you to deal with the ability with really easy to follow movement, and this strat also helped our healers keep everyone topped up, as everyone was in range of the AoE healing. The only problem crops up is when people move early. If a patch is placed in the path of everybody else, then people are probably going to get hit and die, and you can couple that with the inaccurate animation of the zones where the AoE damage is actually larger than the zone itself. You can very easily get into some sketchy situations, but either way, we found this way to work out best, and it was easy enough to follow with just somebody calling out when you need to move between each marker.
And once we got the hang of that and we got the boss to 25% health, this is where the second Apocalypse drive starts, and you need to destroy the remaining weapon to stop the cast. And again, once it is over, everyone apart from the tank needs to run towards the back of the room to reduce the damage from the eradication hit, and then immediately move back towards the boss and stack up right underneath him. After the second weapon has been destroyed, the boss actually gains another 20% damage increase, as well as another stack of the ticking raid-wide damage. However, he no longer has any abilities apart from the fell bombardment on the tank, so there are no mechanics going on apart from just serious amounts of ticking damage going out in your raid, apart from having your tank need to run out and your other tank taunt. So this last part is pretty much kill the boss before he kills you. The first time we got to this point, we wiped really quickly because the ticking damage really caught us off guard. However, once we got there with a little bit more mana and more healing cooldowns saved up, it was far easier to deal with. But that's the encounter.
So, yeah, it's not a bad first boss. I really like him. He's got a lot going on, especially for a first boss.
Even though there's only, 6 mechanics or something?
Yeah, but it's a lot of movement that you need to get on with, where it's like moving with the tank debuff or moving out with debuffs or going to zones. And even during the Apocalypse drive, you've got to
dodge the lines.
Yeah, dodge the lines, and then you've got to run back and then run to the boss. It's a lot of movement for a first boss, which is nice, because sometimes during a first boss and it's like you're just standing there and nuking him, and there's nothing really to do.
Scorpion.
Yeah. There were unfortunately a couple of issues with this boss, which of course is to be expected on the PTR, but it's fun to point them out anyway. Sometimes in phase 1, the boss would only ever cast either Annihilation or Decimation when he's supposed to be doing both, which isn't great. And as we mentioned, of course, the Decimation visual doesn't actually match the initial hit of the ability, and sometimes the ability didn't have a visual. So you kind of had
flat out invisible.
You just had to guess where the AoE stuff was on the floor. But those bugs aside, one thing I do like about the boss is that it has a choice, which you normally don't have on most bosses anyway, but let alone for a first boss.
Yeah.
Because you actually might change what weapon you're going to destroy depending on your raid size. Of course, with that many zones to soak in a small raid size, it's super unviable. It's just horrible to even try.
I'm pretty sure they'll change that.
Yeah, I think they're going to change that as well. But maybe in a larger raid size, say you had a bunch of druids as well, they'll absolutely love that kind of situation, and maybe you want to do that instead. But as long as both choices do become viable, I think it's going to be a really neat part of the fight.
And I think it just does a good job of setting good first impressions. It's just a good initial tone for the rest of the instance.
Yeah.
One thing I would say about the boss, the last phase is really fun if you're a healer. Mm-hmm. I thoroughly enjoyed it, I'm not going to lie. But I can see how perhaps it's maybe a little bit boring for DPS, because you're literally just sitting there and just nuking the boss. It becomes Butcher.
Yeah, I guess because it's only a small amount of the boss where you actually do that, the rest of the fight you are moving quite a lot, but at the end it is just, I'm going to sit there and nuke the boss. Maybe, I don't know, he should be exploding and loads of little circles are appearing on the ground. You got to sidestep them or something, just to give you something to do maybe.
Maybe a mixture of both those mechanics, a bit a smaller version or something.
I don't know. Maybe it doesn't need anything. It is a first boss. It doesn't need to be crazy. And I think it's as you said, a very good start to the instance.
So thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little preview, then please do drop us down a like. We appreciate it. And before we do go, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. If you wish to join this lovely group of people, a link for that is in the description. And thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.